This is Pat Tormey. I'm here to show you Azure SQL databases. First thing you need to understand about them is you don't have to know all of Azure just to jump right in. You can start using SQL databases as if they were on-prem. There's not a lot of difference, and I'm going to show you how to get there. First of all, we're going to start by logging into your Azure website. I'm going to come down to SQL databases. As you can see, I have one to do is come down to my SQL databases and tell it I want to create a new SQL database. And so it says, okay, what do you want to do? This is a fairly standard menu when you get through anything in Azure. Quick Create's usually the best way for me to start. And I'll give it a database name. You give it a subscription, and it says, would you like to have it, which server would you like to have it on? I'm going to create a new SQL database server. This one I'm going to have in North Central US. And my login name is going to be Pat Tormey, and my secret password, which I'm not telling you. And tell it to create the database. And this will spin for a little bit. While it does, I'll check and see if there's any interesting messages from Azure. Worrying about it unless it impacts this video. Okay, so now I have my Azure 101 database. You can see it's online. It's in North Central. It's under that subscription, and there's the server name. Its current size is 1 gigabyte. If I click in here, I'll see the dashboard. The intro page, and then the dashboard. What's interesting here is it says right up front, here's a couple things you might want to do. You can install SQL Data Tools. I've already done that. You can get a starter project. But the first one you really need to do is to set up the Windows Azure firewall rules. Now this is interesting because what Azure does is it allows you to filter which IP addresses are going to see the database, be able to see the database. Now this is only remote databases. If you're designing a web application that's going to run in Azure, you don't have to worry about the IP address of where it's going to run. But if you're going to run something against the Azure database, for example, SQL Server Management Studio, which we will do, you're going to want to include your local IP address anyway. Now the next thing you want to do is you want to use your view your SQL database connection strings. And there's a list of choices there. I'm going to take the ADO.NET one and just copy that. Just so I have a reference on hand when I need it a little bit later. Now, if you look at the server name, it's a very complicated looking server name. The reason is that each one of these is unique, identified by the system, and I don't believe you're able to change those. Okay, a couple things here. You can monitor the activity through the database. And you can scale the database. Now, here's what's interesting. There's the web size, and then there's the business size. Understand you'll pay different depending on how much storage you want. In the web, you can get 100 megabytes, 1 gigabyte, and 5. So we'll just leave that. That's fine for now. Now you have the option here to manage the database. Here's where that username comes in handy. And I always copy it, just paste it in, just so I can't remember it. And I'll tell it to log in. And now you have this beautifully empty Azure database. This isn't exactly the way I like to work with it, though. So I'm going to, you can do this course online from anywhere, which is very convenient. But I think for our purposes, we're going to go and use the SQL Server Management Studio. I'm using the SQL Server Management Studio for 2014. I'm not sure it's that much different than the one on your desktop. I'm going to tell it I want to connect to the database. And then it'll say, where do you want to connect to? This is where I go and get that rather elaborate database name. I'll copy a little bit off screen here, and I'll drop it in. We're going to use SQL authentication. And my username now is designed to include that bizarre prefix. and I'll tell it to remember my password and connect. Now, for our purposes here, this looks exactly like the local or on-prem SQL Server. And you can do exactly the same things to it. You want to create a new table, you can create a new table. Unfortunately, the wizard's not here. For example, if you're up here in, let's just take this database and I want to create a new table. You get this kind of access-like looking wizard thing. You don't get that when you're working in the SQL Server Management Studio version of Azure. Well, you're in tables, I want to have a new table, and it dumps right to the script, which is not my favorite way of looking at this. But there's a couple things you can do, and I can help you out with that. As I'm typically working in Visual Studio, and I'm here using Visual Studio 2013, all I have to do is go to my data connection here and say I want to add a database connection. And it'll say, where would you like that to go? Again, back to my clipboard to pull it out of my notepad and drop that guy right back in here. Same thing for the username. And then tell it what database would I like. Well, there it is. Surprise. Azure 101. I'm going to test the connection. That tested fine. I also recommend whenever you're doing an Azure, any kind of database connection, you take the time to set this property right here. That's because later on, if you're slowing down your SQL Server or somebody blames you for something going wrong with blocking, you can look at the profile and find the application name that's actually running. That doesn't happen unless you take the time to give it an express name. And so I'll say OK now. Now, as you see, I have everything I need right here. I want to create a new table. And it drops me into my semi-familiar looking design platform. It's going to default to ID. I use the capital K-E-Y on the tables that I'm going to use. It keeps me from losing track of it when I'm programming. And I'll tell it to go ahead and update that script. I'll close the design platform. Refresh this. Then like I'll have a table in there. In the table, if I want to, I can show the table data. There doesn't happen to be any. And there's your perfectly empty table. Okay, so just to wrap up a little bit, what you have, and what I wanted you to understand about this, is that when you go into Azure tables, SQL Azure databases, all you really have to do here, Azure 101, is create the database, find out what the connections are, do a little configuration to it, set it up for allowed IP addresses, if you want to access it remotely. And then once you have that database, you can treat it exactly as if it was any other SQL Server database. Which case I showed you was using SQL Server Management Studio. I'll refresh this. There it is my cool table in there. And of course, an easy way to manage it from here is using Visual Studio. So this is Pat Tormey, and I've introduced you here to SQL Azure 101, and I'm just trying to kickstart you to understand that you can use a piece of Azure. You don't have to memorize and learn the whole thing. You can just find the nuggets you want, start using them.